Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges. Welcome back to Policy Chats. Today we are honored to be joined by Ambassador Barbara K. Bodine, a retired career Foreign Service officer and a former U.S. ambassador to Yemen. Over her more than 30-year diplomatic career, she worked on Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, counterterrorism, governance, and U.S. regional policy, including service in Kuwait and Iraq. In today's episode, we will explore how American foreign policy is developed and how decisions are made in Washington and how it plays out on the ground and what Ambassador Bodine's career can teach us about diplomacy, crisis leadership, and the future of U.S. foreign policy.
That's
So
a
to
lot.
start,
That's going to be a lot to cover.
yep,
Okay.
it will
All
be an
right.
interesting episode. So to start off, let's talk about your career. Throughout your career, you have worked in places where U.S. foreign policy was shaped by many competing priorities, including security, regional alliances, counterterrorism, governance, energy, and public perception. From your experience, how is foreign policy actually developed inside the U.S. government, and what factors tend to have the greatest influence before a policy reaches the public or becomes a official position?
Okay. Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Um, I'm going to say up front, and then I'll address your question that foreign policy is currently not being made in any kind of process um, that is open to the word process. So we have the way that policy was made and the way that policy should be made and the way the policy will be made. But right now we have a very sui generis situation. Every country in the world, we have competing priorities. There isn't any one country, friend or foe, large or small, where it is one issue and one issue only. And so the job of the Department of State, the role of the embassy, of diplomats, is how do you balance those competing priorities? Um, and there may be times when one of them is more dominant, more immediate, uh, the one that you have to focus on right now, and others need to be accommodated. But you never go with just counterterrorism, just counter narcotics, just governance. Um, and an example of why that isn't a very good idea is this was many years ago, um, and it was in Myanmar, and we were rightfully very upset by the military coup. And so there was a decision that we should sever our formal diplomatic relations with Myanmar, with Yangon, in order to demonstrate our displeasure. Well, the problem was we had a major counter-narcotics program there, the Golden Triangle, as it was known. And by making our policy on one issue and one issue only, even though a very important one, we actually ended up hurting ourselves and hurting a lot of other people because we cut off all of our counter narcotics cooperation. Now, how you would balance how we felt about the junta and how important counter narcotics was, that's where the art of diplomacy comes in. How do you figure out how to do that? But they all need to be, excuse me, governed, balanced. Um, artfully so that you are moving on several tracks at one time. The final point I'll make on this is that diplomacy is not an end in itself, it's a tool. Diplomacy is the way that you understand and know what these issues are. You know their relative priority and importance to us. You know their relative importance and priority to the host government. And by understanding those relative priorities and the situation on the ground at the moment, you can then figure out how do you balance and shift, competing, but hopefully not negating priorities.
Yeah, completely agree with you that diplomacy is an art and it's also a tool. But as a follow up, I was just curious about how these foreign policies are made. So, is it the president who set these priorities, or is it the state of secretary of state? Sorry,
Yeah.
um, or who generally set these priorities?
Yeah. They the basic priorities, the macro priorities are set by the president. He, and it's still only been he has been elected by the American people. He sets the priorities. Where it starts to get either complicated or, to my mind, interesting is how are you going to implement those policies? For example, um, we want to contain China's influence in Africa. Um, I think most people would agree with that as a broad policy. But are you doing it by coming up with incentives for American business to invest more, to be more engaged with the economy, with trade, with development in each country? So are you doing it by incentives? Are you doing it bilaterally? Are you doing it with your partners, the EU? Or, and this was the case in the previous Trump administration, there would simply be an ultimatum that if you go ahead with this Belt and Road Initiative, we will cut off all aid. Um, okay, in a sense, they're both trying to contain Chinese influence, but one of them is very coercive, very short term. And again, like the Myanmar example, very counterproductive because as we can see now with the pandemic starting to emerge in Africa, um, when we shut down aid, we shut down our access on health issues, on education issues, which lead to security issues. So using the coercive tool tends to not be terribly effective, but it is a tool. Where the State Department comes in is that we take these macro policies and we do look at what are the programs that would advance them, preferably through incentives. What does it look like on the ground and what will work? And this is where the embassy comes in because the embassy has the day-to-day ground truth, what is happening. What would be effective? What would advance our interests? What would affect, if you like, also our strategic profile? Um, if we are only focused on one element of our relationship, then we tend to the rest of the population or the other sectors of the government, feel no buy-in with dealing with the Americans. So it goes from macro at the president to broad policies and programs at the Secretary of State. And then as you go down the bureaucracy and also you go laterally to the embassy, you start getting more and more specificity, more and more this program, this policy, this approach, these talking points, these people.
Thank you. For the next question, you spent much of your time in your career working on the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, including Yemen, Kuwait, and Iraq. These are regions where Washington often has to balance long term strategic interests with sudden crises. When policymakers are developing a foreign policy approach toward a complex region, how important is local knowledge from diplomats in the field? And what happens when decisions are made mainly from Washington without enough attention to political and social realities on the ground?
Um, well, I would say the embassies are critical. How is that government, how is that public going to react, support, or perhaps not support what it is you're trying to do? What would be the cost to long-term strategic, economic, other interests by taking a particular short-term action that jeopardizes a long-standing relationship? And we have a perfect example. Washington, the president's office, we're still in the middle of the Iran war. It's not over yet. It may be in the next hour or it may flare again. But that was done, I would say, well, I do know, it was done without consultation with our embassies. It was done without consultation with the governments in the region, many of whom are long-standing friends and partners of ours. And we basically put them in harm's way. If you look at the attacks on Oman, Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi, they have borne the brunt of our action. Perhaps it was necessary. I personally don't think it was necessary to attack Iran, but that's a different debate with a different expert. If we were trying to change the regime, if we were trying to get rid of nuclear weapons, if we were trying to do whatever the goal was, but we did it without actually talking with the people in the region who are going to pay the price. If we did it without, I would say there was not a full understanding or appreciation of the realities on the ground in Iran and Tehran. It looked like a really good policy, perhaps, if you were sitting just in Washington. We don't like the regime. We don't like the nuclear weapons. We're going to get rid of them militarily. Okay. But you don't know how it's going to play in Iran, and it hasn't played the way they thought. You don't know what it's going to mean to our friends and allies. You don't know what the long-term consequences of being, I think for some people in the Gulf, they feel betrayed. They feel made vulnerable. They don't feel attacked. They have been attacked. What is the long-term consequence on our security? What is the long-term consequence on our bases? What is the long-term consequence on business and investment and trade? So you need to understand those nuances before you take what may look very nice in one office for a very specific reason, and you haven't looked at the nuances. You haven't looked at the ramifications. You haven't looked at the cost.
Yeah, it's super interesting how you bring into different factors such as long-term economic economic impacts
Mhm.
and all of those factors.
Yeah,
So, as you
they do. They're all there together. They
yes,
cannot be put into silos or pots or even short-term versus long-term.
yeah. And that's why diplomacy is such an art. It is the art of balancing these factors and prioritizing um, what factors are needed in those times.
Right.
Yep. And so, as U.S. ambassador to Yemen from 1997 to 2001, you
Mhm.
were working in a country that became central to U.S. concerns about counterterrorism, state capacity, regional security, and governance. So, when a country is viewed through a major security issue like terrorism, how does that shape the way foreign policy is built? What are the risks of allowing one policy concern to dominate the entire relationship
Yeah.
with a foreign state? And what would a more complete diplomatic strategy need to include?
Yeah. Um, I think Yemen is a good example. Unfortunately, there are others of one very important, but one issue, um, basically blotting out almost the rest of our relations. We had built over time we had a very good relationship with Yemen. They had never attacked us. They had generally supported us, or at least not opposed us. The Yemenis, there are lots and lots and lots of Yemenis in the US, and so they felt a very strong personal connection to the US. And we had been providing, it's one of the 20 poorest countries in the world. And we had been providing development assistance, scholarships, health care. We were doing midwifery training, in parts of the country where there was one health provider for every 250,000 people. Um, Not good odds. And the Yemeni government and the Yemeni people, and governments reflect their people. That's who's in the government are people from that country, a very basic fact that sometimes gets lost. Um, they saw us as committed to helping Yemen develop, not because we're a charity organization. We are not Mother Teresa. We are doing this because a stable Yemen with a credible economy, with people who feel that they have their basic services addressed, are more stable. And stable countries tend to not to be places of terrorism, insurgency, or finally with Yemen, missiles being fired at ships in the Bab el Mandab. So our investment in Yemen was very much on the development side, but it had a strategic and long-term importance to us. When we went in full on counterterrorism, and I will say that we had been cooperating on counterterrorism for the 4 years that I was there. This was not something that we didn't know anything about and weren't doing anything about. But after I left, it became almost solely counterterrorism. And it was what we were asking of the Yemenis was, we want to use your airspace to fire our cruise missiles at Al Qaeda. Now, Yemenis were not fans of Al Qaeda. They were not Al Qaeda supporters. But we turned them from being a partner in their development and their long-term stability into being accomplices to our firing missiles at Al Qaeda. And they began to feel like they were not partners. They were simply instruments of what we were doing. What would have been, I think, more effective is we should have increased our development assistance, our commitment to the stability of the country, and then made it more clear that the Yemenis do not like terrorists, that it was a partnership to get rid of Al Qaeda. And I think we would have been far more effective. I think Yemen would have been more stable. And it's impossible, as you know, to prove a counterfactual, but perhaps we wouldn't have a 10-year plus civil war and the carnage that's happened there.
Yeah, I that is really interesting because at our school, UCR School of Public Policy, our motto is solutions for the region, solutions for the world. And what your answer just said, create a strategic partnership in order to fight counterterrorism instead
Mhm.
of using them as a tool. It is, one of the keystones of diplomacy where we
It is.
treat the other side of the table as a equal partner, not just
Yeah,
as a tool of like a tool.
a tool. I
Yeah.
mean, I think we just leave it at a tool.
Yep.
And this gets to the importance of alliances and alliances across the world. Um, we know how important NATO is, but we also have, you can have, if you want, an alliance with a capital A or an alliance with with a lowercase a, but you have partners. And to the extent, and this is also in our interest, to the extent that we help a government, a people, a society be able to defend itself, provide for its own security, then there is less that we need to do. So if we help develop a Yemeni counterterrorism capacity, then will they be able to do everything we do? No, because of the sophistication of they would still need our intelligence, for example. But we would not be carrying the whole load.
As a follow-up, how do you think future like partnerships with other countries can be like further fixed? Because you also earlier you mentioned how um there wasn't any like consultation with people of expertise when dealing with other issues. So how do you think these like issues can be fixed like further on in the future?
Well, we spent, we, the United States, and I am not a member of the government anymore, but we, the United States, made it a core part of our foreign policy, of our national interest, to develop alliances around the world following World War II. That was the core of our diplomacy, was build as many friends and alliances and partners as we possibly could for mutual purposes. NATO being the strongest, but not the only one. One of the parts of this is I will often tell my students that diplomacy is really just good manners taken to a global stage. Your grandmother would be pleased, kind of thing. And you treat people with respect. You talk with them, not at them. Um, you don't trash talk them. That's nobody's grandmother would support that. It's a question of respect. It's a question of communication. It's a question of not just treating them like partners, but actually seeing them as partners. They are partners. They're not being treated like a partner. They are a partner. And that's subtly different. Um, we have been very successful at this up until recently. And at this point, we are not. Part of it of also being a good partner, being a good alliance, having mutual friends and mutual assistance, is you have to be credible. And again, this kind of goes back to personal relations. If you are making threats, just thinking your own friends or within your own family, you're making threats, or you're making promises you don't fulfill. If you are not credible, if you do not have personal integrity and, in a sense, national integrity, which I would call legitimacy, if you also, and this is one of the things that we really worked on, we were not perfect. There are major examples of failure, but we tried to live our own values. That national security is not just hard power security, and prosperity is not a question of economic dominance. But it is a question of mutual security and mutual prosperity, of helping develop countries. Think of, and also your values and principles. And was our approach successful? If you look at the world in 1960, even getting close to 1970, most of the world were colonies and protectorates and extractive economies. You look at the world today, there's 194 members of the UN, and I would say there's a bit of a continuum, but at least a third of them are middle powers. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Gulf states, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico. We can sit here for a very long time and sort of, exactly where does somebody fit on the continuum, but there are middle powers. They have their own economies. They have their own national interest. They play on the international stage. That is quite an achievement if you look at the world 1950, 1960, 1970, or even 1990 with the fall of the wall. We are living in a world that is really a world of success with some very bad flaws that need to be addressed, but a world of success. And what we should be doing is nurturing that, not trash talking it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important that treating everyone with respect and also being that like credible source is important. For the next question, during your time in Yemen, the United States was also dealing with the aftermath of the USS Cole bombing, which placed diplomacy, security cooperation, intelligence, and law enforcement under enormous pressure. In a moment like that, how does the foreign policy process change when there is a crisis? Who becomes involved, what pressures increase, and how can diplomats protect long-term strategic relationships while Washington is demanding an immediate response?
Yeah. We went from having no presence in Aden to I had the CIA, the FBI, NCIS, diplomatic security, the Joint Counterterrorism Office, and a partridge in a pear tree. I lost track of how many agencies showed up. All of them there to help, of course, but all of them had a slightly different mission and a slightly different, if you want, culture of how they operated. NCIS is very small. The FBI is massive, kind of thing. And they all knew what they wanted to do, what they needed to do so that we could find the perpetrators, bring them to justice, and prevent a similar attack someplace else. We also had a ship that had been severely damaged. Didn't sink, but that was really by the grace of God and a lot of hard work by the crew. So the Navy, who was also there, obviously, the Navy's first priority was to secure the ship, keep it from sinking, secure the crew, and secure the casualties and get the casualties home. That was what the Navy was focused on, the ship and its people. Good. Absolutely. FBI, investigate, find the perpetrators, find out how this happened, bring them to justice, basic law enforcement. Okay. CIA, learn more about who was behind this so that we can keep it from happening again. Already the FBI and the CIA are starting to be at odds with each other. And then it just rolls. Who's responsible for security? So what I did, is we had 4 missions: the ship and its crew, a joint investigation with the Yemenis because we can't investigate in Aden. First of all, we don't have enough agents who even speak Arabic, much less know their way around, much less, what you need. And be able to do a good intel to keep it from happening again. And then all the smaller people, smaller agencies kind of fit into those three. But then overarching was to maintain a good working relationship with Yemen. It's their country. They're a sovereign state. We need their police capacity and their own local intelligence if we are going to get those two things successfully done. We need their help to keep the ship from sinking. We use their hospitals for our wounded. And so all of these players and all of these missions were all predicated on our ability to continue to have a good working relationship with Yemen and the government and the people. And my job as ambassador and the job of my embassy was to keep all these pieces, first of all, not working at cross purposes to each other, which on the American side, we were constantly at cross purposes to each other, and not having the Americans at cross purposes with the Yemeni. And so that was my job, was to I had to know what everybody was doing on the American side. I needed to know who they were doing it with on the Yemeni side. I had to deconflict within the Americans. I had to deconflict sometimes within the Yemenis, and I certainly had to deconflict between the Americans and the Yemeni. I knew that we had these three core missions, and that my mission was to make sure that the first three missions could be successfully done. And that meant working with the Yemenis. So it was this balancing coordination issue that we talked about at the top of the podcast. That's what we were doing. That's what the embassy was doing, was to make it possible for all the special agencies to be able to operate effectively for the broader mission.
Yeah, and as a follow-up, when you said your job was to maintain the relationships with the locals, with the local government, with the Yemenis, how do you do that? Can you give us an story, an insight on what are the intricacies behind of
Yeah,
keeping
a lot of
maintaining
it.
that relationship?
Yeah. I think one advantage that my team and I had was that I had been there for almost 4 years at that point, and a number of my senior officers had been there for at least 2 years. So we knew the Yemenis knew us. We knew who was effective on the Yemeni side, and we knew who could be an obstacle. We knew the president certainly knew me quite well, but we knew all the other players. And what we did was keep the lines of communication open. I am a firm believer, this goes to the credibility that we were just talking about. I'm a firm believer in candor, not necessarily not being insulting, but you can be candid with somebody. In fact, sometimes the greatest respect you can show somebody is to be candid with them. When there was a problem on my side of the relationship, I would work to get it resolved. If there was a problem on the Yemeni side, I would candidly talk to them about these are the obstacles we're facing. And I kept the communication going all the time with with the support of my embassy and some additional diplomats who got sent in, which is the importance of diplomats on the ground. We got more. It was really communication, candor, and relationships that I think made it effective. They knew us, we knew them, they trusted us, I knew who to trust.
Thank you so much for listening to Policy Chats. We invite you and your loved ones to the conclusion of our 10-year anniversary event series with an end-of-year celebration. Here, we will honor the graduating class of 2026, our scholarship recipients, and the entire School of Public Policy. Nilufar Soja Razavi and Katie Chow will serve as graduation student speakers, and Dr. Andrew Light, Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs from 2020 to 2024, will serve as the keynote speaker. California Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis will provide recorded video remarks. This celebration will be from 5 to 7:30 p.m. on Sunday, June 14, 2026 at the UCR Culver Center of the Arts. You can RSVP in the description linked down below. We hope to see you join us for this very special occasion.
Yeah. So let's change topics a bit. Let's move a bit to Kuwait. So you served in Kuwait during the Iraqi invasion and occupation, and later worked in Iraq during the early reconstruction period after the fall of Saddam Hussein. These experiences place you close to the intersection of military action, political planning, diplomacy, and post-conflict governance. What did those moments teach you about how foreign policy can be succeeded or fail when military objectives are not matched with realistic political strategy? And
Yeah.
how should policymakers better connect security planning with diplomatic and governance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Kuwait and Iraq were extremely different circumstances. And I think Kuwait is an interesting example when put up against Iraq in 2003, because if you look at how we handled the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the ultimate liberation of Kuwait, within about 6 months, one of the reasons is that August, September, October, November, December, the first 5 months of that. So for the most of the time, it was a diplomatic effort. The reason that Desert Storm was successful to a very, very large degree, we got the UN on board on day 2. We had full UN authorization and legitimacy for action with a very clear mission: liberate Kuwait. In the course of the months that followed, we built a coalition of 35 countries. We did not do Desert Storm by ourselves. We had 35 different countries involved, which was useful, at least at minimum, in terms of capability, but also legitimacy. We gave Saddam multiple opportunities to back down and back out. We used sanctions. And all the time that we were building this diplomatic edifice, we were also building the military capability in Saudi Arabia. So they were working, it started with diplomacy, the military came in, and then the military took action. But you had a foundation built by our ambassador in the UN, Tom Pickering, our Secretary of State, James Baker, and all the other members of the national security team. And it was an absolutely brilliant example of diplomacy and military, bilateral, multilateral, working together so that when Saddam refused to withdraw, okay, we're going to do Desert Storm, and in 100 hours, it's over. That didn't happen just simply because we had the military force on our side. It happened because of everything that had been built. You contrast that, and we also stayed with a mission. We got Saddam and the Iraqis out of Kuwait liberated Kuwait, but we did not go into Iraq. We did not have what maybe your professors have already taught you, mission creep. We didn't get so carried away with our victory that we decided we were going to go all the way to Baghdad. No. Liberate, end. With Iraq, we went in unilaterally. We did not have the UN. We did not have our allies. We did not have regional states on board. A little bit like Operation Epic Fury. We did it. We thought we could do it all by ourselves. That we could overthrow an entire government, a country the size of 25 million, 25, 30 million. And that we could then impose a governing structure. And it was all run out of the Department of Defense. I went into Iraq technically as a DoD employee. I was seconded from the State Department. So everything was done over at Defense. The planning for humanitarian was done at Defense, not AID. The intelligence, they had their own intelligence. They had their own humanitarian. They had their own everything. They brought people in, but it was all done through the Defense Department. The military was not given enough tools. Famously, Rumsfeld did not allow the second tranche of military forces to go in. And then on the cheap and on the quick, we tried to rebuild an entire country. It's almost as if we took all the lessons of Desert Shield, Desert Storm and flipped them. And it didn't work very well. There's a quote from Edward R. Murrow when he was the first head of the VOA way back in the Kennedy. I read about this in a history book. But he said, if I'm going to be doing the Voice of America and explaining US policy, I have to be around for the takeoff, not just the landing. In other words, I need to be there as the policy is being developed. I understand what the objectives are. I understand what tools we're using. I understand, and I might even be able to help shape if you expect me to explain it at the other end. Well, it's the same thing with military and diplomacy. We have to work together. We need to understand what they're doing, what they're doing, and how they're doing it, and maybe sometimes why they shouldn't. They need to understand what we can bring to the table. And when we become disconnected, when the diplomacy and the military are not talking and working together, you have failure. And there are any number of examples.
I think it's very important to communicate and also see the whole process as a whole, in the policy development and also after. And so moving on to policy, one theme in your career is the gap between policy as it is designed and policy as it is implemented. On paper, foreign policy can look clear, but on the ground, diplomats often deal with uncertainty, incomplete information, local resistance, cultural differences, and changing political conditions. How should foreign policy be designed so that it is flexible enough to survive real world implementations? And what mistakes does Washington often make when it turns broad strategic goals into actual policy?
Well, when Washington is working correctly, it is not micromanaging the field because it's not there. And this goes back to an earlier conversation we had where Washington sets the broad parameters. They may have policies or programs they think would be useful and fit, but they have to work with the field because the field is going to say, yes, that will work, or no, that's really not going to work. That's going to be counterproductive. So it has to be a very active conversation. And I'm going to use the same word again. It needs to be a collaboration. It needs to be a partnership. Because if the field goes off and does things without really consulting and working with Washington, it's going to become disconnected from policy, and it might even become counterproductive to policy. So the field cannot go off and do everything that it thinks is a good idea, irrespective of Washington. But Washington can't tell the field what is going to be the most effective thing to do, or the most effective way to do it, or with whom in the host government would be the most effective partner. So they have to balance each other. The Washington looks to the field, or at least should, when I think it's working well. It looks to the field for ideas as well. As an example, when I was in Yemen, we were very concerned about security. We were very concerned about economic development and prosperity and all those things. And it occurred to me this one time, not all by myself, but in conversation with people, that Yemen had a 2,000-mile coastline, which I think is roughly California's. And they had no Navy, no Coast Guard, they didn't know their fisheries, they didn't know their weather patterns. They had smuggling, they had illegal aliens, refugees coming out of Somalia. They had a lot of problems, and they also had toxic dumping. Anyway, the fact that they could not control their coastline was a serious problem to security and to their economy. And a couple of us talking, they don't need a blue water navy. They need a good Coast Guard. They need a Coast Guard. Kind of went, this would address two things that they need and something that we can do with them. We're very good at this sort of thing. So I then propose it to Washington that if we're interested in this and this, we need to do this. And it took about 6 months of negotiating with Washington, the head of the Coast Guard, people in fisheries, and all sorts of parts of my government I barely knew existed, to be honest, until I understood better what a Coast Guard can do, should do, and how does it do it. And then go working with the Yemenis on, is this something that would be useful to you? But I needed to be able to understand what Yemen's needs were, understand how our policy fit with that, come up with an idea. But I couldn't go off and do it on my own. I needed to get Washington on board. And then I needed to get the Yemenis on board. And they, to this day, have a very credible Coast Guard. I don't know anything about how to run a Coast Guard boat. I do not know how to do search and rescue. I don't know how to do what they do. But I could understand why this might be important to them and to us.
Yeah, that is such a big accomplishment. Equipping a Coast Guard force so they can protect their coastline and police it also.
Yeah.
So now you teach at Georgetown University interesting classes like Frenemies Forever, U.S.-Saudi relations, or negotiation, mediation, and political persuasion. So kind of my question is, which, you are a professor, and that gives you a unique perspective on both practice of diplomacy and training the next generation of diplomats. When students study foreign policy, they often focus on presidents, secretaries of state, wars, treaties, or major speeches around the world. But from your experience, what should students understand about the less visible process behind foreign policy, including interagency debates, embassy reporting, negotiation, regional expertise, and the daily work of building relationships before crisis happens?
Yeah. Well, building relationships before crises happens is one of my taglines on diplomacy. Diplomacy is building relations for issues you do not yet know you're going to have. So thank you for using one of my favorite lines. I appreciate that. When I'm teaching diplomacy, yes, you need to know about the treaties and the secretaries of state and the presidents and prime ministers and all of that. But what I teach is you need to understand the role of history. You need to understand because you need to know that person you're talking to. You need to know where they're coming from. What is their history? How does it influence how they see themselves? How does it influence how they see the world, how they see us? What are their aspirations? What are their fears? What do they need? What do they think they need? And maybe what do they need? Sometimes those are different. And I'm always getting my students to go deep and understand who it is you're working with and why. And even if you just want to focus on the foreign minister, you need to know where he went to school. You need to know what his grandfather did in the war. You need to know his personal history. You don't just meet the guy in the suit. You need to know who these people are and why they are and their identity. You need to understand the culture in which they operate. You need to understand the environment within which their country. I'm infamous for giving map tests. If we're going to have a class on the Arab Gulf states, I'm going to give you a map of the Persian Gulf states, and you need to be able to tell a Bahrain from an Emirates. Because if you don't, how can you understand what their policies are? So and what I tell my students in my capstones, which are our really big policy classes, is, and this comes from kind of a personal history, is I don't want you to necessarily learn all the facts about the Arab Gulf states that I've accumulated over a long time. That's not the issue. The issue is I don't want you to, it's not the answers. It's, do you know the questions you're supposed to ask? What are the questions I need to ask? What do I need to learn so that I can do this? And where this comes from is when I was an undergrad, I was a China studies major. You want to know about the Tang Dynasty? I had it. I could read, write Chinese. I was gonna be one of the great China scholars of all time. And went into the Foreign Service, was gonna go to Beijing once we opened because we didn't have relations then. But I was all locked and loaded to go be the first diplomat into Beijing. My first tour was Hong Kong. Okay. Second tour was Bangkok. Yeah, we're getting a little bit away from China, but we're still in Asia. And then I was recruited to be the desk officer for Yemen and do security assistance and sales for the entire Arabian Peninsula. And one of the things that I said to the people recruiting me was, I don't think I've ever met an Arab. Where would I in Hong Kong? Where would I in Bangkok? That wasn't I have never wanted to. It's just never had the opportunity. I don't know anything. I don't even know there was a country named Yemen. And now you want me to be in charge of it? You guys are crazy. And they said, no, well, maybe we are, but we still want you to come and work for us. So what I did is I went, okay, when I started studying China, I didn't know anything about China either. So I needed to know the history, the geography, the economy, the foreign relations of the Tang Dynasty all the way through the end of the Chinese Civil War and beyond. I needed to know all these. I needed to understand Chinese culture. I needed to know Chinese fairy tales because fairy tales is how we convey our values. And I went, okay, so this is everything I did when I was a student learning China. I need to take all those questions and I need to sort of say, okay, what do I need to study? Read about Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Oman. And if you're going to be successful, it is that you know the questions. You don't necessarily have the answers yet.
Wow, that was eye-opening. Before this podcast, before you answering that question, I only heard of the saying, play the people, not the game. And so what that means is like, you need to understand the person on the other side of the
Right.
table before you start negotiating. But I didn't know
James,
it
yeah.
happens such on such a large scale of like countries, whole countries, like through like fairy tales. That is amazing. So
Yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, in fact, I use the game analogy that a very good chess player knows how to move their pieces. A great chess player knows how the other guy is going to move his chess places.
wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
recently I heard, I listened to a podcast. I think that person was a ex-CIA, and he got recruited by a professor in George Washington, and they focus on studying world leaders, like everything from A
Mhm.
to Z, like their habits, what they like to eat, what their everything about them, and
Right.
it's really important to negotiations, especially debating or
Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
diplomacy when you
Yeah.
negotiate with them. So it's really interesting. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the
Oh, I'm
podcast
so
today.
sorry.
Uh,
This has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Your questions are superb.
well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for spending our time and joining Policy Chats.
Well, my pleasure. And best of luck to all of you
Yeah.
in your next school year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.